Stuka Joe here. Today we are going to talk about Brotherhood and Unity, but not only about the game. We're going to talk with the game's designer. That is Tomislav Čipčić, and we have him here today. We're going to talk about his background as a wargamer, how the game came about, and we're going to talk about the cards in the game, specifically the most important cards. Some of the cards in the game, we'll be taking a look at them, and some of the mechanics in the game, and much more information about this game that interested me because of the particular conflict. It's also a card-driven game, and it's a true three-player game. So let's bring in our special guest.
Hi there.
And here we have him. Tomislav, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. It's hot here. I'm sweating, but it's all right.
Okay.
How are you doing?
I'm doing great. And just to give the viewers some perspective, where are you physically in the world right now?
I am in Split, Croatia. That's in Europe. If you look at Italy and go eastwards 100 kilometers, you'll find me. And I mean, it's summer. It's full of tourists. Everybody's on the sea. And I'm here in this closed, small room talking to you. And I wouldn't change it for the world.
I'll go. Thanks. And what time is it right now over there?
It's 9 p.m., a little bit after 9 p.m.
Okay. And I'm in Guaynabo, Puerto Rico. That's in the Western Hemisphere. And it is 3 p.m. or 3:05 p.m. So thanks to the wonders of technology, we can do these things that we could never do before. And let's talk about yourself first, because I mean, we're going to talk about Brotherhood and Unity, but I understand this is your first design.
Yeah, this is my first published design. I've designed games since I was 7, but this is the first time I said, all right, I'm going to try to present it to the world, so to speak. Yes.
Okay, so the first published design, and obviously any person who designs a war game, usually the person is a war gamer first and then becomes a designer. Mm-hmm. So let me ask you, how did you become engaged in wargaming? How did that come about?
Well, when I was about 7 years of age, my dad bought me a first computer. That was in 1983, and it was a ZX Spectrum 48, I think. And I bought some games, and one of the first games I played was Tobruk, it was called, by the old company SSI. How was it called? I can't remember exactly, but it was a great game, and that was a true war game, you know. It wasn't hex and counters back then. It was like rectangle grid, but you moved those divisions you attacked, and I was hooked from the day one. And from that moment on, I watched for every strategy game, war game I could find on the computer. And since we lived in Yugoslavia back then, we didn't have access to the games you had. I didn't hear of SPI or Avalon Hill until 2003, 2004. So I played these games mainly on computer and did some my own war games on a piece of paper and a piece of cardboard. But very much after that, in 2003, 2004, when the internet came and Google came, I found out that there are many other people like me who like these games, and there are a ton of games on a piece of paper that are so in-depth, so intriguing that I had to have them. And I bought my first one. That was in 2005, I think. It was Europa Universalis. I watched the Callendale video came later about that game, but I read about it. I played a similar computer game, and I bought the board game. I wanted to see what was it all about. And slowly but surely, then the next one was, I think, Panzerblitz. And then I went to Coin Series with Cuba Libre, and then little by little Empire of the Sun and DAC 2 and all those other beautiful games. And now 16 years later, I'm pretty much involved neck deep into wargaming hobby.
And when you were encountering those war games, Panzerblitz and the other games, Cuba Libre, did you play solitaire, or did you have a group to play the games with?
I had a group of friends all that time. We mainly played computer games, but I persuaded them to play tabletop games with me, and not so successfully, I might add. So mostly I played, and until today, I played solo. Just last year, I found a guy in Split that also likes these games, and he bought for himself, I think, Kharkov. Was it Kharkov? By Mark Simonich, by GMT Games. Zog Bond system. So we played that one. It was a great game.
Okay. And so how did you start designing games? How did that come about?
Well, first of all, when I was little, I did that on a piece of paper, and I made some miniatures of the Play-Doh, and I did some plastic modeling. I was a plastic modeler, so I did like 30, 40 various types of tanks or aircraft. And if I had smaller models, I would play war games with them. True, miniature war games, yeah. And later on, when I bought a PC, then I started to tinker with video games and made some not complete video games, but like video game prototypes, also strategy games, Battle for Šibenik, some battles from the Croatian War on Independence, and so on. And then when I saw in 2004, 2005, all this beautiful world of tabletop wargaming, then I started to experiment with that. So first of all, I made my version of Europa Universalis, then I made my version of 1776 by Academy Games. This was on the topic of shogunate of the Sengoku Jidai, Japanese period, historical period. And then the third one, basically, was Brotherhood and Unity. But by that time, I had so much experience because I also, in parallel, did a video game for like 7 years. I didn't succeed in finishing it, but I learned a lot, especially about making graphics, you know. And when I made Brotherhood and Unity, most of it came from me, from graphics, because I really enjoy making maps and counters. For me, that is one of the most important aspects of making a game, making it visually clean. And so by that third game, I had probably learned a lot, and I said, why wouldn't I try to publish it? And then I contacted Compass Games, and it's all history, as they say.
Yes, actually, the game was published last year, and it's been very well received. I mean, it's about, for me, it's about a conflict that I know very little of, even though it's relatively recent. And it's about a very, it's a civil war, but you have a three-way civil war in a very small region. And something that caught my attention when I spoke to you before is that you were in that region when it was happening, right?
Yeah. And
if a shell would have fallen somewhere else, we maybe would have not been able to make this interview, right?
Yeah.
So,
that's luck for you, yeah.
Because the war that the game recreates is the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which starts in 1992, but there was what they call the Croatian War of Independence, happened the year before, right?
Yeah. Yeah, practically those two wars are so connected you can consider them the same war, basically, if you look at it, because war in Croatia started for real. It started even in 1990, but started with actual offensive operations for real in 1991, in the summer, June of 1991. It lasted until the beginning of 1992, when there was a truce. And it continued as a series of interspersed offensives, mostly by Croatian side, up until 1995, when the Operation Storm basically changed the situation in such a way that the Serbs practically surrendered and said, that's it. But all this time, war in Bosnia was waging from 1992 to 1995 in parallel, and since basically Croatia is surrounding Bosnia from two sides, since Bosnia looks like a triangle, two of those sides are surrounded by Croatia, and Croatia had a lot of influence to the development of that war. They were there present with their troops, with their supplies, with their armament, and you can consider that as the same war, basically, in a strategic sense.
Yes. And have you had an interest in designing games that revolve around that particular region where you live, which is Croatia and Bosnia Herzegovina, either during that same period or before, like World War II, because there was a lot of action there with Tito and his partisans in World War II, right?
Well, all of that came of late because I didn't really read a lot up until a couple of years ago about all these happenings in this region, because it was so close and personal to me. I rather read about Rommel and North Africa and Eastern Front and Normandy, D-Day, and even Pacific and American Civil War. I knew much more about that and Napoleon than this history. But I don't know, 5 years ago, I started reading a lot about these wars that happened here, especially Croatian War and war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And you know, when you design games, you read a lot, and when you read a lot, from time to time, you find that golden book that really has all the necessary things for you to start making a game, you know. And when I started reading this book by Davor Marian called Homeland War, Domovinski rat, I started writing down notes, and I realized I have all the main components for a game. The game was actually had to be about Croatian War and independence, but little by little I realized that better version of it would be the game solely about war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Because it's a continuous war, it's a small country, it's very compact, it has 3 sides, it has many things which you don't see every day, you know. 3 players, small game, fast game, modern war, not very covered subject. So I said, yeah, I should do a game about it, and I got all that information from that book. And then I became interested and read more and more about it.
And that book, do you know if there's an English version of that book available?
I'm not sure. I think it's not. But if anybody wants to start reading about the military history of that war, they really should start reading Balkan Battlegrounds. It's a 2-volume book. It's freely downloadable as a PDF. It's done by a group of analysts from CIA, and the amount of knowledge they had and they presented in that book is astonishing. And it's probably the most objective book, because all of the books I read from the local authors, mostly Croats or Serbs or even Bosniaks, they are all colored in one or the other national color. Unfortunately, still after a quarter of a century, objectiveness is seldomly found. But in this book by CIA specialists, you can really see the situation developing. And there are many games, only if you read that book, there are many games in that yet to be made.
The game Brotherhood and Unity, mechanically, it's a card-driven game. So why did you decide to make it a card-driven game?
I love card-driven games. I mean, when my first card-driven game, I think it was For the People by Mark Herman, and I fell in love with the mechanics right off the bat. And also, I played Hannibal, which is also a beautiful game, but For the People was the one for me that really showed me how you can put all this history in those events, which give you, first of all, a change of rules, because cards are nothing other than the rules, but not written in the rule book, but they are written on the cards. And you play with cards, which is always fun. And you have all those ways of mixing, combining, playing those combos, or maybe interrupting your enemy or stealing their cards. That's also fun. And you can put all that history into cards. If you have 200 cards, you have 200 historical events, which is beautiful. And when I finally got to Empire of the Sun, which is for me maybe the best war game there is for me at this time, you know, because it really gives you that very complex war in a concentrated package. And card-driven games are simply beautiful. What I'm even trying to do now, since I started again designing video games, trying to find the way to make a video game with cards. I mean, not with cards, but to have that same fun you get as when you're playing them in person.
I mean, the cards, I like card-driven games a lot too, because what you say, they condense a lot of rules in an easy to digest form, which is when the card comes about, you have the rules right there. You don't have to pull the rule book, and you can pack a lot of historical events there. Now, I noticed that in Brotherhood and Unity, there's 3 sides, and you use dedicated decks for each of the sides, because there are some card-driven games that have just one deck of cards, and both sides, or whatever sides they draw from that deck. So why did you decide to go with a dedicated deck of cards for each side?
I do not want the player to lose choices just because he drew a card which doesn't belong to his side. I want a player to be able to use each and every card he has, especially so because this is a short game, a game of 3 hours length, where one player has 1 hour of gameplay time, and he really needs that those cards, each and every one of them, packs a punch. Not even that, I also decided not to use a combination of cards. For instance, in Paths of Glory, you play 1 card as a prerequisite for another card. And for me, spending 2 cards in such a short game would be devastating. People wouldn't be so easy to do that. They would rather spend them for operations. So I had to do that because I was restrained by the length of the game, primarily because of that.
Okay. Now, I noticed that in the game, there's 3 dedicated decks of cards, 1 for each of the factions, instead of other games that have 1 deck of cards from which all players draw their cards. Why did you decide to make a dedicated deck for each of the sides?
But that was primarily because the game is so short. The game lasts for like 3 hours, which gives each player 1 hour of gameplay time. And it has really a limited amount of cards, each player does. So I wanted each card to give him quite a punch. I didn't want him to lose some card ability because he drew the card that belongs to another player. That was one of the reasons. And also I decided not to use some other mechanics as well, which you can sometimes find, for instance, in Paths of Glory, and that is mechanics of combined cards, when you play 1 card as a prerequisite and the other card in a combination with that one later on. And for me, using 2 cards to give you 1 advantage is too much in such a short game. So primarily the length of the game said, no, we will use each and every card. And even Mark Herman, when he did Empire of the Sun, he divided the decks. And initially, I think for the people, the decks was single, I think. And in Twilight Struggle, the deck is also single. And I never liked that logic that I can draw the opponent's card and then I need to do his event. I mean, it looks fine. It creates some other tension, but I prefer it this way.
And then the other thing is, in this game, it's 4 turns, but you divide the game into 2 epochs. You have the early war, which is 1992 and 1993, and then you have the late war, which is 1994 and 1995. And then the cards, there are cards that come into play only in the early part, in the early war, and other cards come into play only in the late war. So what did you want to achieve by dividing the decks that are already by faction into epochs?
Yeah, well, I wanted to achieve to show how this war has changed as the war progressed, because at the start you had very strong Serbian faction armed by the Yugoslav People's Army. You had Bosniak faction, which was mostly unprepared and badly organized, and Croats who had the experience from the war in Croatia from the year before, so they were well prepared, but still they were the smallest faction, and they didn't have as much ammo and armament as the Serbs had. So that was the characteristic of the early war: Serbian offensives, Croats lagging behind, and Bosniaks just trying to survive, not to be completely destroyed. And in 1994, 1995, when the Bosniaks reorganized, when they got their armament and ammo and all they needed, and the Serbians, when they extended themselves too much and shown the world their bad side, so they were first of all under sanctions and later on bombarded by the NATO. I wanted to show that by switching the initiative to the Bosniak side in 1994, first of all, and then changing the amount of cards, reducing the amount of offensive cards for the Serbs and increasing the amount of offensive cards for the Bosniaks. And that is that shift. If you look at those cards, in early war, Serbs are the ones, and in late war, Bosniaks are the ones who are leading the charge.
So you have another characteristic that I like about the game is that all sides will go to the offensive and to the defensive in some point in the game. So because most games, like you're defending all the time or attacking all the time, if you're one side. Here, the Serbians are going to be on the offensive at the beginning, and they better make good use of the first two turns, right? Because it's going to get nasty against them in the last two. And then the Bosniaks are going to be, as you stated, disorganized and purely on the defensive. They have to survive and hold on to these key spaces in the first two turns, because then they're going to receive resources. So they go into the offensive. So it gives the players offensive and defensive capabilities in the same game. So that's something that also called my attention. Now you talked about the NATO here and their influence in the game. And in the game you have the foreign attitude track. Can you tell us what is that, and what does it attempt to recreate?
Foreign attitude track is a lot of things mixed together. First and foremost, it's the stance of the European Union, of the United Nations, of the Great Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Russia, USA, those big powers towards this war. This was a televised war. All through the war, there were CNN, Christiane Amanpour, all those people from the news, and just filming and showing the world those nastiness from the war. So you had that that influence of these foreign powers that throughout the war analyzed what is happening and really restricted the war of going really too far. You might not think that was the case, but it was the case. There are many instances where the attackers could have made even more war crimes, but they stopped themselves because they knew they will have consequences later on. And I wanted to show that somehow. If I didn't have that, what would stop the Serbs from winning in turn one? I mean, they have so much power with all those tanks, all those artilleries, everything. They can obliterate certain parts of the map, especially the enclaves, because Bosniaks were mostly surrounded in enclaves throughout the country, and they could obliterate Srebrenica, Gorazde from early on. And they did not do that because not only did they lose their steam, but foreign powers saw that increasing human catastrophe. So I also wanted to represent that human catastrophe, because when you capture a city, what usually happens, you round up all the civilians, put them in buses, and drive them to the nearest front line and turn them over to their friendly forces. And that's if they are lucky. If they are not lucky, then they can be rounded up and put in prison camps and all other horrible things. So I wanted to show that somehow. I didn't want a player to move those buses and those refugees on the map. That would be too gruesome for me.
Mhm.
And that would change the dynamics of the game into something I didn't want it to be. But what I did is, when you capture a city and when you release all those people to prison camps, or remove them, so to speak, do an ethnic cleansing of the city, you escalate the war, and you lose your prestige in the eyes of the world. And if you do it too much, they will give you sanctions and they will slow you down. And if you continue to do that, they will start their NATO airstrikes against you. And if you still continue to do that, you will hypothetically lose the war. That never was the case, but hypothetically, if they did all those nasty things forever, somebody would have probably intervened with ground forces.
And
And
that
that's the
happens,
idea.
and that happens. You lose what is called foreign attitude points when you, for example, you capture a key space, which is a large city, because you create this refugee crisis, right?
Yes.
But it also happens when you bring in foreign units.
Yes.
And these foreign units are pretty powerful in the game. And so I noticed that all of the sides have, in one way or another, they had units from the outside coming in to help them out, right?
Yes. They did. Serbs had those beautiful red units. They are red because they wore red berets. They were called red berets, or jedinica, the unit of the Služba državne bezbednosti. That is a service of national security service. And those were like super paramilitary forces of the Republic of Serbia, who were in war in Croatia and war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, used on all the important fronts. They were ex members of the how do you call them, Red Star Belgrade football club, not the players, but the how do you call them, navijači, the ones who are watching it, football fans, fans of the club. And they were recruited, so they were very tough guys, and they did a lot of horrible things, but they were good troops, well armored. And there were many troops like that. Croatian army had early troops, which were good, and late war troops, which were excellent. And the Serbs also had parastate in Croatia. Rebellion in Croatia created a new military there as well, and those units can also help you. And even Bosniaks had, first of all, Bosniaks who fought against Bosniaks in Cazinska Krajina. They separated from other Bosniaks and fought on the Serbian side. You have that. And you have Mujahedin, which were volunteers from the Islamic countries going in fighting for the Bosniaks. So all of these units are available to you. If you use them, you will get really good units, but on the other hand, you will lose reputation.
So you have to, you can't, you have to control your side. You can't bring all the foreign units you want, and have to be very choosy with occupying key spaces, because if foreign attitude deteriorates, I mean, the sanctions at the beginning is that you lose movement factors, you can't strategically redeploy, you can't advance beyond the defending space, but then the NATO airstrikes are pretty brutal, right?
Yeah, they should have to be, because it's all a result of playtesting. I made it much less effective, and then I playtested it a lot, playtest, and I realized that they needed to be really pumped up. And all the things you see, all of these DRMs and stuff like that, came as a result of playtesting. You need to consider that this is a short game. It originally was meant to last for 16 turns, but it lasts 4 turns. When it lasted 16 turns, it had the cards very similar to Paths of Glory, with much smaller dice roll modifiers, with much smaller movement capabilities, and so on. But when I shortened it, I need to increase the value of each card to make things move, to make it dynamic. and playtesting show that these are the true values. And you need to be afraid of the NATO bombing. Otherwise, what's the use? What's the purpose of it?
Exactly, yeah. And I notice also that, for example, as to the map, again, you were the graphic artist. The map is, I like the spacing of the map. There's spaces between each of the points on the map. So you don't have these, the map is never cluttered, and it's very, let's say, comfortable to use. And you have 5/8 of an inch counters here, so that the counters are also sizable. And I think Compass did a good job with the counter.
Compass did a great job. They really chose
the
good quality. Yeah. I was astonished when I got my copies, because I never thought that the game would look so good. And I really love that thick, good map board, which is not bending. It's beautiful. It always, and the counters are well rounded, all individually punched. Beautiful. I couldn't have asked for more. And the glossiness, that glossy finish.
Yeah, looks very nice.
Beautiful.
Now, let's talk about the combat result table, because there's other card-driven games. For example, Paths of Glory has an odds-based combat result table. In this game, it's a combat effectiveness table, right? The result is going to be a multiplier by which you're going to multiply the combat strength of your units. And that will give you the loss factors that the other side has to absorb. So when you go to the attack, you want to get that precious ×2, but it's not always possible. But a times 1.5 is not bad, right?
Yeah, it's not.
And sometimes even just getting the ×1 will do the job if you attack with enough strength factors, right? So what drove you to create the combat system using that multiplier, that combat effectiveness multiplier?
I was researching and think about those algorithms for combat results since I did my video game starting in 2004. So I was really researching that particular subject for a very long time for other games I did. And what I realized is that you really need to have something that is efficient and that shows the main characteristics of the combat you wish to portray. And it must not be overly complex. For me, the problem with combat results table always has been that I cannot remember those numbers. You have 8, 10 columns, you have 6 rows, that's 60 values. You can't remember them all. So each and every time when I try to think, will I be able to fight? What are my chances in this combat? I do not know. I need to check and see that middle row and see, middle row gives me this ratio and maybe I could win. For me, that is not good, because when you fight, you need to have a good grip of what your chances are. So I said, no, I won't use combat results table. Then I saw some other games, tactical games, for instance, the company of Conflict of Heroes by Academy Games, which is a great game. Which uses a system where he combines that attack factor plus dice roll modifier. I tried that. I tried the system that Mike Rinella uses in his area impulse-driven games, similar to that. And then I remembered my favorite, Empire of the Sun, and I did an homage to Empire of the Sun by using that efficiency table. Because if you look at it, that's it. You have combat value, which is written as attack value and defense value, and then you have your luck. And what does the luck do? It changes your attack value and your defense value by some factor. And which factor is that? You roll a die, 10-sided die, and that gives you a factor: 50%, 100%, 150, 200. Basically 4 numbers, 4 values which you have to remember. And 1/4 even. That's really for the worst cases.
Yeah.
And you can remember those numbers. You know, when you roll that 7, I'm able to do this. When you roll 5, I'm able to do this. And you know your chances. You can see for yourself what are your chances for each and every combat. And that speeds up the game. And that removes one big chunky table from your player aid and from your table and from your lap, which is beautiful.
Yeah. And by the way, the player, I'm gonna show it later, but the player aid is just one letter size sheet in cardstock, printed on both sides. So the thing I like also about this game and other games that I like is that the less you have to consult one of these huge player aids or consult the rule book every time, the less you disconnect yourself from the game. So it's more immersive. The game is more fast and more immersive if you don't have to be constantly consulting these player aids. And in the case of the combat of this combat system, it's easily committed to memory with even the die roll modifiers, and so it makes the game move fast. So that's one thing I was impressed by it. It's simple and elegant, but also it drives you to try to get those modifiers, and then many of those modifiers are in the cards, right? Mm-hmm. You have some cards that recreate particular offensives that occurred historically. And that's something that I like. Also, that I saw before in Crusade and Revolution, when the Republican side would launch these offensive like El Ebro, and you have that the game encourages you to go onto the offensive at that time, and this game does the same. And there's some cards that give you really powerful modifiers and artillery bombardments, and we're going to take a look at those soon. Now, strategic will is the way to win the game, right? Is how the victory is measured mostly in this game. Can you describe the victory conditions and what is that they attempt to recreate?
Yeah, well, finding the right victory conditions is in a game like this is a difficult task. It's not your standard hex and counter game when you take these objectives and that's it. What was the goal of each faction in this war? And there are still debating even today what each side wanted to achieve. My opinion is, as every designer needs to have an opinion, this is my opinion. Mm-hmm. My opinion is that each side fought for the territory. And if you look at the peace plans and peace talks, they were constantly being done in Geneva or some other place. They were talking about how much territory will each faction receive. Serbs wanted to get 60%. Croats wanted to get, 25%. Bosniaks wanted to get 40%. They talked about percentage of territory. They wanted to get territory, but not just any territory. They wanted to get strategically important territory and territory where their population is, if not a majority, then represent a really big part. For instance, Serbs are very populated in parts of so-called Bosanska Krajina. They wanted to get Krajina. Croats are represented very much in Herzegovina, Zapadna Herzegovina. They wanted to get that territory for themselves. And also, for instance, Serbs wanted Posavina, although they are a minority there, but it is so strategically important for them that they wanted that region. And when I realized that, I said, all right, I will divide the map in the regions, as Mark Herman did for the people when he divided the USA in the states. And then I will use his mechanism, which is you need to take a majority of spaces in that region, plus you need to take all of the key spaces, important cities in that region. When you do that, that region is yours. Having only to take the majority of space, it wouldn't be good, because when you lost that one space, you would lose the region. When you took it, you would get that region, and that would be too dynamic, too chaotic. But when you add that additional deal that you need to have a requirement, need to have at least all of the key spaces, then you have that lock. And when you capture a region, it's much easier to hold on to it and to lose it. Much harder to lose it than to take it. And when I realized that's good, I divided the country in regions and just said which regions belongs to who. some regions are only interesting for one faction. Some regions are interesting for two factions. There is maybe even a region interesting for all three factions. And when you capture a region, any region, you get points. You always do. But at the end of the game, if you don't control your key region, you lose points. And
That's
also,
something I noticed. Yeah.
if you want to win, you need to have your key regions, because if Croats didn't have Posavina, they will lose some of their prestige. They didn't achieve one of their strategic goals. They maybe took some other region, which wasn't their strategic goal, and they got those points all right, but they lost the one they really needed, and they lost not only the points, but twice the number of points, because that was their key region. So those key regions drive the players towards certain regions. That's one of the incentives for Bosniaks and Croats to fight one against each other. Otherwise, why would they fight one another? That's why. Bosniaks wanted to capture that region, Croats wanted to capture that same region, and then you have a clash.
And you have 15 regions on the board, and it is there are many regions that at least two of the factions, it's a key region for them. So let's suppose, for example, that one of those factions captures that region. That means the other faction is going to get the value of that region as deducted from their score as a penalty. So it's not only that if you capture the region, you get the points, but you prevent losing points in the event that somebody else captures a region. So not capturing a key region and letting somebody else capture it, it's going to take away from your final score.
Yeah, and that's one of the key points when players play, experienced players, especially in Spain and Poland. They play the game constantly, as I can see from the other action reports. What they found out, sometimes it's not, for some regions, it's not it's a waste of time to fight. For instance, for Sarajevo, for Serbs, you can really drain yourself if you try to capture Sarajevo. But if you prevent the Bosniak, if you just keep enough forces to prevent Bosniaks from taking Sarajevo, Bosniaks lose those points. But you don't need to capture Sarajevo, because you would bleed yourself dry. And that's what the Serbs actually did. That's the good thing when you really hit that nail in the head, when you really got right that model of the game. Serbs had the siege ring with, I don't know, 10,000 troops, 8,000 troops, and in the city there were Bosniaks like 30, 40,000 troops. And they tried throughout the war to punch through, and they couldn't do that, because Serbs had a very well-established firing lines, and they had mortar fire for the first line, supported by the heavy artillery fire when the enemy broke through deep in the territory, and they had fast response forces to fill in all the gaps. And they could tie entire corps of 30, 40,000 troops with only 8,000 troops. So they did just that. They didn't lose the region, but they didn't really want to take it. And that's how you play this game.
These are maps, right?
Mm-hmm.
What kind of maps are these?
These are the maps which were drawn for the and used as exhibit for the case against Ratko Mladic in the International Crime for the Ex-Yugoslavia Tribunal in Hague. And these maps are the copies of the actual maps which were used to conduct offensive operations by the Serbian Army of Republika Srpska. And most of them are showing the operations for capturing Srebrenica.
Okay.
This is, for instance, Radna Karta Operacije, that is work map for the operation, military secret, Vojna tajna, Zvornik, Brigade of Zvornik. This is Krivoja 95 operation, for instance. Mm-hmm. And I think this is Srebrenica pocket. And you see the Serbian forces in red and yellow, and the breakthrough of the Bosniak blue forces towards their positions. What they did, they rounded up all the mobile men and just ran in a big group trying to get out from Srebrenica. You see, and Serbs tried to stop them, but most of this group that went northwest got away and succeeded in reaching the Bosniak lines. Those that were left in the pocket were mostly killed in that infamous Srebrenica massacre. And that was the case against one of the most important exhibits against Ratko Mladic, the flow of this operation.
Now we have, for example, there's another map here, but you use these maps in the game, right?
As a background, because these maps, I love maps, especially these topographical detailed maps, and I used one of these maps. I desaturated it to lose almost all of its color and increase the resolution and really sharpened it up. And if you look at it real in detail, you see all those villages, all those roads, all those rivers around Srebrenica. So each time you play a card, you know that this card is made on a detailed actual combat map used in that operation.
So we have some cards that we want to show, and also show the board as we show these cards. And let's start with the cards in the Serbian deck. And here we have the Posavina Corridor Offensive card. And why is this one of the most important cards for the Serbian player?
Yeah, Posavina Corridor Offensive was one of the most important operations, and it will be definitely studied at the military schools, at least in Serbia, if not in other countries, because it changed the strategic balance in the country. It successfully connected two parts of the Serbian countryside, and yes, and that's why I chose it, and that's why it is probably the most powerful offensive card in the game, that gives really Serbs some punch in trying to capture that region.
And here we see the map on that area, on the Posavina area, and we see that the Serbians start the game here in Semberia, right?
Yeah.
And Posavina is here, so that card can only be played in Posavina when attacking Posavina. So here you have a big incentive to use that die roll modifier. And Posavina, something that called my attention is that Posavina is the region that is in the way in between these Serbian forces that have full supply and these other Serbian forces which are in what the game calls an enclave, right?
Yes.
So all these Serbian forces that are in Krajina and Severna Bosna and Južna Krajina, these Serbian forces cannot trace supply to any Yugoslav space, because there's these Bosniak forces and Bosniak spaces preventing that. And while they cannot trace supply to any space in Yugoslavia, then they have to trace supply to key spaces in this enclave. And there's only 4 key spaces, and each key space can provide supply to 3 units. So you're going to be able only, if you're the Serbians, to supply 12 units in this enclave or pocket, unless you connect that enclave to a source of supply here in Yugoslavia. And that's why Posavina is so important at the beginning of the game. And I ask you, historically, was this the case in 1992? The Serbians wanted to connect that enclave.
Yes, Yes, most definitely. That was the topmost priority for them, especially when they saw Croats started their offensive. They took Derventa and almost got Doboj, and they divided them in two, and they realized they need to do maximum effort where they really used all of their best forces and best commanders, and they successfully did it in a couple of months. I even did a lecture on BeotaCon this year on that same topic, 1.5 hour lecture on that operation in detail. That is a very interesting operation.
And another thing that I find interesting, when we look at this region, Posavina, let's zoom in. You see that there's, at the right, we have Brčko, which is the one of the 3 key spaces in Posavina, and that is in control of the Bosniaks. Then you have Doboj, which is a second key space, which is in control of the Serbians. And then you have Bosanski Brod, which is in control of the Croats. So you have the 3 spaces that are the key spaces. Each faction controls a space, but the Croats have an advantage because they can trace supply to this space in Croatia here, which is
Slavonski Brod.
Slavonski Brod. So they have unlimited supply, and their foreign units can enter the game from there, right?
Yes, that's what they did. They took the best units of the 4th Guards Brigade, Četvrta Gardijska Brigada, and really brought those reinforcements, and they really packed a punch there. Those were really elite units that Croats used from the Republic of Croatia constantly. And there was a logistical base of the Croatian army in Slavonski Brod, which gave all of its supplies of armor and armament and ammo to their colleagues across the river in Bosanski Brod.
Okay, so that's we're just showing this card first, but showing the importance of this card. It gives you also what the rules state. It's like an artillery preparation or artillery support that you roll twice, and you can reduce 2 Serbian units on a roll of 3 through 9. So you get that capability before executing the attack, and then you execute the attack and get a +5 die roll modifier. And also you can advance beyond the defending space 1 additional space. That is something that normally the only units that can do those are the mechanized units in the game. So this is a very, very powerful card. And of course, you can only use it if you have it in your hand in the first turn, right? So there's the fact that this is a card-driven game, and the fact that you don't get the same cards every time you play the game is what gives the game some replayability. So that's a very interesting card. Let's take a look at the next card that we have here. And this is Serbian Intervention. This is, I think you talked about these fellows, the SDG.
Srpska dobrovoljačka garda, Serbian Volunteer Guard.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Arkan, infamous Željko Ražnatović Arkan. First they were used in Croatia in capture of Vukovar, then later on in operations at Maslenica in Croatia. And when the war in Bosnia started, they were used at the beginning. If you remember those images of Serbian soldier hitting a dead corpse with a leg, that was a picture taken by Ron Javillo, I think. And those images were showing soldiers of this unit. They entered, yes, those were the Red Berets, infamous Red Berets. They captured cities of Bijeljina, Zvornik at the beginning of the war. That was in April 1992. And those horrible stories came to Sarajevo, to presidency, to Alija Izetbegović, and Izetbegović went there in a car to see what's happening up there in Zvornik and up there in Bijeljina and Priboj. And he heard from the men on the ground that these units, these Srpska dragovoljačka garda, were going house to house and just shooting people. And
Pretty
that's
nasty guys.
and when they took Zvornik artillery unit from Yugoslav army across the river in Serbia was shelling the positions in support of the attack of the Serbian forces inside Zvornik. So it was a very well prepared operation in April and May in 1992, and that's why the Serbs really got that very big initial success in capturing it very, very fast, because this is what the Serbs call Podrinje corridor. And without these towns at the border with Serbia, they cannot survive. And this was one of their first goals, to clear this area from Bosniaks so that have a good logistical base in Yugoslavia. And second of all, to connect through Posavina to enable Banja Luka and that western enclave to survive this war.
So I see, yes, that there's like a corridor of units at the beginning of the game that the Serbians have that reach Sarajevo. Well, obviously, and all Serbian units in Sarajevo, which at the beginning of the game it's like, I think there are 8, draw supply from this route to Yugoslavia. So that's it's a deep penetration of Serbian units in what is Bosniak territory, and that's how the game starts already, with the Serbian units in Sarajevo. But this particular unit that we're talking about, I saw in the extended example of play, they begin the game, well, they're placed, I mean, you can use them however you want, right? But in the beginning in the extended example of play, they were, I think they were placed here
in Bijeljina and Priboj, yes.
In Priboj and Bijeljina, and they attacked, and actually, in the extended example of play, they take Brčko. So these are these are foreign units in the game, right?
Yes.
And as foreign units, you get a penalty when you bring them to the board. You get the foreign attitude deteriorates. So when you bring these units in, this track here, you're going to have a -1 for bringing the units. And I think that at the beginning of each turn, for each type of army of foreign units that you have on the board, you also get a decrease in foreign attitude. So the more you use these units and leave them on the board, foreign attitude is going to deteriorate, right?
Correct.
And we were talking about the foreign attitude track, and you stated that when you reach level 1, your side receives sanctions. And these are 1 less movement factor, no strategic redeployment, you can't advance after attack. But here, when you get to this point, then come the NATO attacks. And how are NATO attacks reflected in the game?
Each time a player begins his round, we check if any of the players is on this level 2. For instance, it's Croat's turn to play. Yeah. First of all, he checks, Serb is on level 2. We're gonna bomb him. And then player next in order of play of the Serb, and that's the thing you need to understand. For instance, if it is turn 1, after Serb, it's Croat's turn to play. So in turn 1, Croat will always be the one rolling those dice. So when it's Croat's turn to play, if a Serb is on level 2, he will roll 1 die and choose 1 unit. And if he hits, rolls 3 to 9, that unit is flipped to reduce side. Then he will choose another unit, roll another die, and that's it. Then it's the Bosniak's turn to play. And Bosniak, and then again, Croat rolls, not Bosniak, it's always Croat who rolls. And then Croat again rolls 2 dice. Then it's Serbian turn to play. And then again, Croat rolls 2 dice. So actually, when you enter this level 2, you will be bombed first when you enter that level. And then those next 3 rounds. Round 1 Croat, round 2 Bosniak, round 3 Serbian. So you will get 4 possible bombings, but it doesn't succeed every time. It succeeds if you roll 3 to 9. So it succeeds 70% of the time. Let's say 2/3. Let's say 2/3 out of 8 will be 6. 6 of your units, 5 to 6 of your units will be reduced if you enter that. And then you get the chance. What you actually do, Serbian will usually, I'm talking about Serbian because it usually happens to them. Serbian will play a card to reduce that to level 1, and then he will be okay. But he will have 5 or 6 units probably reduced when that turn is finished.
But to reduce, to improve foreign attitude and move the marker to the left, you have to play the card for what the game calls diplomatic action, right?
Yes.
And it's basically a way of you are like you're not using your cards for waging war. You got to use them just to prevent the situation from deteriorating.
Yes, you play a card, then you move this marker. If a card was of value 2 or 3, you move this marker by 1. And if you played a value 4 card, you move this marker by 2.
By 2, yes. Okay. So let's continue with the next card that we have here. And it's the M84 main battle tank. And this one is this is a combat card, right?
Yes.
So this is certain events, combat events you can only play in a combat situation, but this gives you a +5, which is pretty significant, but it has to be in clear terrain.
Yes. This represents the amount of firepower that Yugoslav People's Army had and released that to the Serbian army. And this is really one of the best tanks, the best tank in this war. And this combat card gives you the ability to use it as a bonus when you fight against the enemy. And if you attack in a clear terrain, gives you +5 dice roll modifier and really packs a big punch.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now let's take a look at some of the Croatian cards. We have here, this is an early war card, Prepared for War. And this gives a +2 die roll modifier to the Croatians if they attack Bosniak forces. So it's a big incentive to attack Bosniaks, but there are plenty of spaces on areas on the map where Bosniaks and Croats have conflicting situations, right? Let me see here. We show, for example, the beginning of the game. You have here the area of region of Srednja Bosna, and as you stated, this area does not begin controlled by any of the sides, and that is shown here. There's no control marker here in this space, but this is the key region indicator. It's a key region for the Croats and the Bosniaks. And so if you play this card early on, you have an incentive to attack the Bosniaks who control Zenica there. And the Bosniaks, you stated that they are unprepared for war. And that is reflected also in their combat situation, in their attacks and defenses. You have that penalty here.
-2 dice roll modifier for every combat in turn 1, and -1 in turn 2.
So if the Croatians use this card, let's say in the first in the first turn, they're going to have a +2 in attacks, and while the Bosniaks have a -2 when they fire back, right?
Yes. And that gives the game a great advantage. And if you look at the card, the man in the image is a very important man for this war. That is Gojko Šušak. He was a minister of defense in Croatia. He was from Herzegovina, and was practically pulling all the strings in this war, because he was very well connected with the Croats in Herzegovina, and he really prepared them and the Croatian armed forces very well. And he was the one who was responsible for all those well prepared Croatian armed units. And he was the one probably behind many of the conflicts between Bosniaks and Croats. So that's why he gives you those +2 dice roll modifiers, because it's his strategy to go that way.
And I noticed this, it says remove card for a 2-player game. I know the game brings a 2-player version where basically a player controls the Serbians and the other player controls the Bosniaks and the Croats. So this card, obviously you would remove it there, but...
Yes, it wouldn't be useful when Bosniaks are your allies in 2-player game.
Yes. Okay, so let's go to the next card. And now we have Croat-Bosniak Alliance. And this brings foreign units into the game.
Yes. You have Franja Tuđman, president of Croatia, and Alija Izetbegović, president of Bosnia and Herzegovina, in Washington, drinking. This is in Split, the picture taken in Split agreement. But before that was a Washington agreement, when they decided on, pressured by the USA, to create a true alliance. They even wrote down a memo proclaiming the future confederation between Bosnia and Herzegovina and Croatia, which never realized. It was never ratified in parliament. But that was the extent of the alliance they wanted to create at that moment. And that gives you, as a Croat player, the possibility to use elite Croatian army units, because many years have passed since the beginning of the war, and meanwhile Croatia has really armed itself, got its tanks. All of these brigades had about 4,000 or 5,000 people, and they had 1 to 2 battalions of tanks, which were usually T-72s, and had a large amount of artillery firepower, and even some how do you call it, multiple launcher rockets systems. So they were very, very powerful units. These are the most powerful units in the game. You cannot use them against Bosniaks.
And that's indicated by the different color,
by the black color of the combat factor, yes, because they are a part of the Bosnia-Croat alliance, and they must not be used against Bosniaks. But against Serbs, they can really wreak havoc.
Okay. So that's another foreign unit card, which brings powerful units in the game. And this is a late war card. So this is, you can use it in turn 3 or 4. That's where it comes into possible play. Let's take a look at the next card. We have Operation Storm, also a late war card.
Yes, this is a game changer. This is a game changer. The game is so short, so sometimes you won't need to use it. But if you are in a bad situation, this card can really change the flow of the game, because what it does, and what Operation Storm did, it was a big operation in Croatia conducted by the Croatian army, which destroyed the self-proclaimed Serbian Republic of Krajina. So basically, when you play this card, Krajina does not exist anymore, and all of the Krajina spaces on the map become Croatia spaces. So all these Krajina spaces cannot be used anymore. They become Croatia spaces, and these Bosniaks in Cazinska Krajina are finally connected to full supply sources, and the offensive can start for real from Cazinska Krajina. And that's what happened historically. Bosniaks rearmed themselves and started attacking towards Sanski Most, towards Bosanski Petrovac and Bosanski Novi. And Croats as well, from the direction of Mrkonjić Grad and Južna Krajina and Bosansko Grahovo, went northwards toward Banja Luka, and they came 50 kilometers, around 50 kilometers before, in front of Banja Luka, almost captured it.
So at the beginning of the game, these Krajina spaces, they're not supply sources for the Serbians, but they can trace supply through them, and eventually, if they connect to a Yugoslavian space, they're in supply. But there's some, I think there's some units that are allied to the Serbians that in the early war can come in through these spaces, right?
Yes, those orange units of army of Srpska Krajina, Srpska Vojska Krajine. They are not very powerful, but the good thing is that they can be used. There are a couple of them, I think 3 of them, and these ones are the units of the Bosniaks who fought on the Serbian side.
So when you play this card, those units are taken off the map. Those are the SVK and NOZB units. Those are removed.
Yeah, there are no more.
And you have the more powerful or profound effect that now these are treated as Croat supply spaces. So the Croats can trace unlimited supply to those spaces, and the Bosniaks as well, right?
Yeah, if you take that and you play that Bosnia-Croat alliance card as well, you can really do some damage to the Serbs then.
Okay, so
and that was what happened historically.
Mm-hmm. So that's a very interesting card indeed. Let's take a look at some cards in the Bosniak deck. The Bosniaks at the beginning of the game start very disadvantaged. You said unprepared, and this card gives the players a pretty good idea of it's a Bosniak refugee crisis.
Yes, one of the most important events that happened in this war was this refugee crisis, which manifested itself especially in Srednja Bosna, central Bosnia, because what happened, all these refugees that came from Jajce, that came from Banja Luka, all of these cities captured by the Serbs at the beginning of the war, all of these refugees came in the trucks towards Bosniak and Croat towns in Srednja Bosna. For instance, Travnik, for instance, Vitez, Zenica, Kiseljak, and so on. Jajce fell very early. You have it right there on the top left. It fell, and all those refugees came to Travnik and Zenica, Vitez, Kiseljak, and so on. And what happened is that changed the demographics in the town. If you have a town of Bugojna, I don't know the exact number, 20,000 people or something, and you get an influx of 6,000 Muslim refugees, and you had 50-50 demographics beforehand, and now you have Muslim population of 60% and 40% of Croats, it changes things a lot. Mm-hmm. Especially if those people get arms, and in the parallel, what you don't see but happens behind the scenes, in Geneva, somebody is negotiating on what will Bosnia look like tomorrow. Bosnia and Herzegovina, what will look like tomorrow, and they say, Bosniaks say, we want to be in control of Srednja Bosna region. Why? Because there are more of us than Croats there. How come? Well, all of these refugees came, and now we are a majority in that region. Mm-hmm. And that's what happened. And that was one of the incentives for the beginning of Bosnia-Croat war. Bosniaks used this situation to, in some places, change the control, so to speak, of certain areas. And Croats did that as well. Croats have some similar card that does the opposite. They, for instance, in Prozor, took control of the town before the refugees and their influx of refugees could do that in Prozor. Mm-hmm. So you have a couple of cards like that which stir up the situation in Srednja Bosna.
In this particular card, you can, as the Bosniak, you can choose 1 key or 3 non-key Croatian spaces to switch to Bosniak. So you could choose, for example, you could choose Bugojno, or you could choose 3 non-key Croatian spaces. It's a way like of conquering, if I might say, a territory without fighting, just because of this refugee crisis that's been created.
These refugees enter Novi Travnik and they take control not by themselves. In Novi Travnik, you have in each and every of these towns and cities, you had Croatian headquarters and Bosniak headquarters, Croatian units, volunteer units, and Bosniak volunteer units. 5,000 of these, 500 of these. But when in Novi Travnik, you get an influx of new Bosniaks who are willing to fight, and they get their Kalashnikovs, they can take control of Novi Travnik and without fighting.
Yes. That's okay. Let's take a look at the next card that we have here. This is UN safe areas established. And here you can place one UN safe area in up to 2 of the spaces indicated there. So you have Bihać, and Bihać is in Sasinska Krajina. It's in that enclave that the Bosniaks start the game there. So that's one. The other is Tuzla, and Tuzla is here in Soli, and it starts with 2 units, so it's like a Bosniak stronghold there. And the other spaces are, you have Srebrenica, which is right here, and also Gorazde, which is here. Let me see if there's any other particular space.
That's
so it's
those 4.
Those are 4 spaces. So let's say that we place a UN marker or a UN marker here in Gorazde. What would the effect on the game be?
If the Serbs capture the space, they lose -3 foreign attitude.
Okay. So this is a space that normally you would lose if you capture, the Serbs capture it, it's -1, but because it is declared a UN safe area, it would be -3 on the foreign attitude track.
Yes, I can't remember exactly if it would be -1 plus -3 -4. I think it's -3. Yeah, and that is a great change, and it really makes you reconsider. You would only attack if you were sure that your foreign attitude is very, very low. Otherwise, you can really destroy yourself. Basically, when Serbs took Srebrenica, that was the final straw, and the NATO bombing started for real. And also, Republic of Croatia was given green light to conduct Operation Storm because of the Srebrenica and the massacre and the thing that happened to the UN troops and all of that nasty stuff. It basically was the Pyrrhic victory of the Serbs. They released all those units that were surrounding Srebrenica, and they wanted to use those free units to take Gorazde and later on to finally capture Sasinska Krajina. But because of that, they lost so much foreign attitude that they were first of all bombed, and then Croatia got the green light and destroyed Krajina. And then Croatia entered with their troops into Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the war ended.
Okay, so historically, if we would to play the game historically, we would place one UN safe area marker in Srebrenica, but that would be
and the other one in Gorazde, yes.
And the other one in Gorazde. Okay.
Gorazde didn't fall, but they were thinking of just continuing this operation towards Gorazde and Žepa.
Okay. Now the next card that we have is the Sarajevo Tunnel. And for the remainder of the game, the Bosniak player can use the Sarajevo airport for purposes of a supply path. Now let's take a look at the Sarajevo insert map. In this game, before I show that, this doesn't come with the game. This I did this,
and it should. It's a great
second edition
wooden piece for the deluxe.
Just one additional component. Okay, so this is the area that the Sarajevo map comprises. because Sarajevo is treated as a region because of its importance, right? So I did this little piece so that from afar we know where Sarajevo is. But now let's take a look at the insert map. We see that the Bosniaks have control of 3 of the 4 key spaces, Novigrad, Novo Sarajevo, and Centar. And the 4th key space is to the north, Bogosća. So I mean, this, I guess if I'm playing this game for the first time and I'm the Bosniaks and I look at the value of Sarajevo in terms of victory points or strategic will points, you see it there, 14 strategic will points. It's one of those areas that I would like to control. The problem is that at the beginning of the game, it's the Serbians have a lot of forces there, and what you see here is not the forces at setup. These are the forces after the reinforcements for the Serbians are placed in the extended example of play. So they have, I think they have 3 more units than what actually begins the game there. So in the game, the Bosniaks have limited supply, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Because they cannot trace a line of supply to any Croat space outside of Bosnia-Herzegovina because they're surrounded here by Serbian units. However, what is interesting is that the play of that card, that airport card, treats this space here, the airport, as if it were a Bosniak control space. And let's imagine that card is played. We have this marker here, which is a reminder. So, and what is striking to me is the story behind this event. It's a tunnel that was dug beneath the airport. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, that's the Butmir International Airport in Sarajevo, and it was a tiny, narrow piece of land which was taken by the Yugoslav People's Army at the beginning of the war, and the Bosniaks practically were surrounded by all sides, and this was the place where they could really dig this tunnel. Because it was a narrow strip of ground for a couple of kilometers wide, and they dug this tunnel from the so-called Aerodromsko naselje, that is a small region of the city just north of the Butmir airfield, and they exited near the Ilija part of the city south of the airfield, and you can see how it looked like. They used it to transport supplies and armament and ammunition and people, smuggle people in and out throughout this war. And they also tried continuously throughout the war to break out of the siege, especially at this part of the map, and this is Ilija mountain. And they were even successful, sorry, not Ilija mountain, Ilija part of the city, mountain is Igman, and they even almost succeeded at certain point, but no, Serbs took it back. Serbs took it back because the siege ring was so powerful, so well defended, so well fortified, that really got that stranglehold of the city throughout the war. Mm-hmm. And that's why Bosniaks didn't get those 14 points.
Okay. And one thing that I like about this game is the supply rules. I think they're very straightforward but very effective. These Bosniak units are in an enclave, so they have to trace supply to a key space, right? And each key space can supply 3 units. So Bosniaks have 3 key spaces in Sarajevo, so they can supply up to 9 units. And so those 9 units will be able to function well, but of course, anything beyond 9 units won't be supplied. So eventually, if the Serbians build up their forces with enough strength, there's a chance that they can actually take the Bosniaks if they cannot connect to those supply sources. And so you have at the beginning of the game, what's interesting is you have the Bosniaks with limited supply but concentrated there, and you have the Serbians with unlimited supply, but they don't have sufficient force to take out the Bosniaks.
Yes.
So it's a very interesting situation, and we're just looking at one of the 15 regions. Of course, a very important region, which is Sarajevo. So
that's what this war was all about. You had enclaves within enclaves.
So that's Sarajevo Tunnel. And then, of course, Srebrenica. And this is, I know that, I mean, war is terrible. It's terrible by itself. And if you have atrocities, of course, it's even worse. But the way that they are represented in the game, here you have, this is a card that the Bosniak player would play for the event, and it reduces the Serbian foreign attitude by -2, that's a big reduction. And if it puts the Serbian under NATO attacks, that's going to be a brutal round of 4 to 6 attacks during that turn. So here we have that modeled. You have that modeled into the game with this event card. And the requirement is that the Serbian player has to have a unit in Srebrenica. Not so that's the requirement. So it doesn't mean that the Bosniak player can always play it. You have to have a Serbian unit in Srebrenica. So taking Srebrenica has its cost for the Serbians. So if you want to take it, you can take it if you can, but then the Bosniak can play this card on you. So this is what you were talking about, specifically in historically the Serbians took the city from the United Nations, right? So,
yes. Well, this is one of the cards where you give damage to the enemy, and since the Bosniaks have throughout the game very little amount of actual firepower, they later on have a manpower advantage, but never so much firepower to be effective. They have a certain amount of these cards, which give them some balance in trying to trick and stop the enemy in some other way, primarily this humanitarian way.
mm-hmm.
And Srebrenica is the greatest example of the evilness of the war, because it was the greatest massacre in Europe after the Second World War, and it is a very fitting example for a card, and the final card to show here as a reminder what happens when there is a chaos and unlawlessness and what becomes of it. So if the Serbian player captures Srebrenica and the Bosniak has this card, he can really do much damage, as was historically the case.
Okay, so and this is the last of the. I asked you to select 10 cards that you found that more interesting cards, and that these are the 10 cards. So, but I selected one card that interested me, and I'm going to show you that card so you can talk to me about this card, Miss Sarajevo. This is a late war Bosniak card that, when played, increases foreign attitude by 1 and strategic will by 2, and the requirement is that the Bosniak has to have control of at least one of those key spaces in Sarajevo. And can you tell us about the event that this card relates to?
Well, Miss Sarajevo was the Miss Pageant organized during the war, where the people of Sarajevo and certain people from the media within Sarajevo wanted to create resemblance of normal life within the city, because the city lived all those 4 years being surrounded without water, without electricity, and there were hundreds of thousands of civilians there living there, and they had to do some tricks to make them believe that world goes on and everything will be okay. And Miss Sarajevo is the perfect example of this. This is a picture of Inela Nogic, who won this and later on continued with the modeling career in I think it was in Paris or in London. And U2 was so impressed by this event that they even created a song which they played in 1996, was it? Just after the war, when they entered this Sarajevo, destroyed from all this siege, and this was one of the flagship songs they sang that evening. So this represents the will of the people to resist the war and to continue with normal living.
Okay. And I think it also represents the power of the use of the media in the game, because this was a pageant that was a beauty pageant that was held there, and it was highly publicized. So you have the use of the media also to how do you say, to expand or to magnify the message there. And so I find that interesting, because I mean, I've played Paths of Glory and Crusade and Revolution. You don't see cards relating to beauty pageants in a war game. So it was something that really caught my attention. So
yeah, this is the modern civil war, and in a modern civil war, you have very big influence of the media. And there are a couple of cards, especially in Bosniak deck, which deal with media coverage and how it influences the flow of the game. I think there are 4 cards, I think, even dealing with the media influence.
Okay, so let me show you for 1 second. We're talking about the player aid in this game. This is a game that brings a player aid, which is a 1 sheet, and I really like this map here, because it really tells you all the different situations that are happening on the map at the beginning of the game in each of these regions here. You see the regions that are solid in color. Those are the ones that are in control of, for example, of the Serbians here in Krajina and Bosna. And you see Tropolje and Zapadna Herzegovina in control of the Croats. And then you see these regions, Sjeverna Herzegovina, Soli, in control of the Bosniaks. But you see also that some of the regions, there's 2 factions that the region is a key region for them, right? Like you see here, Podrinje is a key region for the Serbians and the Bosniaks. Then you have Južna Krajina, key region for the Serbians and the Croats. And then you have Srednja Bosnia, a key region for the Croats and the Bosniaks. So you have all these situations on the map that are present, and obviously you have limited resources to wage the war, so you have to choose where you're going to employ these resources. But it's not a conventional war in terms of fronts. There are many fronts, if we can call them fronts, on the map. And this is, of course, it shows you at the start of the game what the situation is. So I really like that map. Helps a lot to try to understand the situation. And you assign a number of strategic will points to each of these regions. Of course, Sarajevo 14 is like the crown, because it's the most important city in Bosnia and Herzegovina. But I think there's another one that has a value of 7, which is Bosanska Krajina, and Srednja Bosna have a value of 7. So
yes, this is the way to show you how complex this war was. Without it, I don't know if a player would be able to visualize the regions for which he or she fights. Because there is no front line. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, the population was so mixed that there was no front line, and the initial drive of the Serbian forces was to create some semblance of clear, ethnically clean areas which would be easier to defend. But if you look at the demographics map made on the population census in 1990, just 2 years before the war, you can see that those enclaves are the main factor that shows this scatterness of the territory, and it is very hard. This is one of the main aspects of this game. You cannot be sure that you will be able to sustain certain territory. You cannot just draw a line and then push in, push back. And that gives this game that certain edge, that certain dynamics, which many people like.
And I want to show you a couple of these regions. For example, here we see parts of Istočna Herzegovina and Zapadna Herzegovina. And there's the city of Mostar is one city, but you divide it into two spaces.
It's divided even today.
It's divided even today, and you have the Neretva River running through it. And see, here you have the this Zapadna Herzegovina starts uncontrolled, the region. It's a key region for the Croats, but the reason they don't control it is because of the Bosniaks in Istočni Mostar. But then you have the Serbians overlooking the Bosniaks at Stolac and Neversinje. So you have this situation that it reminds me of the Polish uprising in World War II, where you had the Soviets overlooking and just waiting for the one side to finish the other before moving in. So you can have that same kind of dynamic here in this game. If the Croats want to take out the Bosniaks in order to control that region.
Not only that, the Serbs had the artillery positions just above Istočni Mostar on that hill you can see there. And the Bosniaks paid the Serbs to shell the Croats when needed. And Croats paid the same Serbs as well when they needed them to shell the Bosniaks. So
wow,
that's the historical fact.
Wow. Supply in this game for the Bosniaks is they can trace supply to a space in Croatia. They use the same spaces outside in Croatia than the Croats. And why is that so?
That was the historical fact. I mean, the Bosniaks supplied themselves from Croatia. They couldn't supply themselves from Serbia. And they needed to have some land base, and land base was Republic of Croatia. So you had a paradoxical situation where Republic of Croatia was the supply base for the Bosniaks, and at the same time the Croats within Bosnia and Herzegovina were in some places at war against that same Bosniaks. So when they got a supply of fuel in Split, in the town where I live today, they would ship that fuel via trucks, made a convoy, and that convoy went through the Croat territory within Bosnia and Herzegovina, and those Croats were at war against Bosniaks, and those supplies finally ended up in Bosniak hands. And the Croats took some fuel for themselves. And if there was a fighting in that region at that moment, they even stopped that convoy for a while, not allowing them to reach Bosniaks. And then the international community or the UN had to step in and say, no, those were the supplies for the Bosniaks, and so on. Mm-hmm. That's one of the layers of complexity of this war. And I represented it in this game as ability of the Bosniaks to be supplied from Croatia, always, as was historically the case.
So in this situation here, the Bosniaks in Istočni Mostar could supply themselves through Zapadni Mostar and Široki Brijeg into Imotski, because that's a Croatian space, right?
Yes. Correct.
That's something that I found very interesting. Now, one mechanic that you use in the game, which I really found interesting, is the one called move before combat. And just to set up a little example here, I'm going to, let's say that we have this situation here where it's the Serbians' turn. They play a card for ops, 3 ops, and they want to attack Brčko. So obviously you would activate Bijeljina and Priboj, but then you would activate also Zvornik, even though Zvornik is not adjacent to Brčko, because when you activate Zvornik, you can move the units in Zvornik one space. For example, you can move a unit into Bijeljina and another one into Priboj, and then they could all attack Brčko, right?
And you can even overstack a space, and stacking limit by default is 3, but you can temporarily overstack it because you check the stacking limit at the end of the action. And if you succeed in capturing Brčko, you will be able to advance with your units in Brčko, and you will be below that stacking limit. And if you don't succeed, you will lose that overstacking unit because that was your risk you took, you know. And that move before combat allows you to make a strategic surprise, and that's what's always bothered me with similar games, because they practically wanted you to use one round to move and to prepare and another round to attack, and that did not allow for surprise. This way you can combine at certain spots, you can combine your units and surprise the enemy, because you need to have the ability as a player to surprise your enemy. Because in tabletop war games, you see everything is in front of you. How can you achieve that surprise? And this is one mechanic that really, in a simple way, gives you the ability to do that surprise just by shifting a unit from one place to another. And because this is such a compact and small map, each space is adjacent to many other important spaces, and you can really, by moving just to an adjacent space, change the dynamics in a second.
Mm-hmm. I found it very interesting. Now, if I was playing this game, I would probably leave one unit in Zvornik just to
because of Tuzla,
because you don't want to give the Bosniaks a free pass there, but you have
like
to take
a chess.
that into consideration.
Like a chess, you need to think a couple of moves ahead, and just like in chess, because the forces are so scattered and you don't have a clear front line, just like in chess, sometimes that rook can move, sometimes that queen can move to a very different part of the map and change the dynamic in one instant.
Mm-hmm. That's right. So that's something I really found interesting. I think that it's a mechanic that I would like to see in more games, to reflect that surprise and that sort of element. I know the game was published last year. It's been well received. I know for you, I mean, you've been on various interviews. This is not new for you. You've play tested the game ad nauseum. So, you know, for us war gamers, it's more exciting because it's a relatively new game. It came out last year. It's a fast-playing game, a three-player game. It's a CDG. It's about a topic that I like to learn about. For me, I like to play games about topics that I know very little of. That's part of learning about history. And so I want to thank you for allowing me to interview you and show the viewers the game and talk about the mechanics and why things are the way they are. So
thank you for this opportunity. It's been a great thing to be able to talk almost 2 hours
yes, and,
about this game.
And I hope that you continue designing games.
Well, I have many interests, even other than local wars. For instance, I'm making a video game now about World War II in North Africa, hopefully to be released soon. I'm deep into AI development for it.
Mm-hmm.
And later on, I will probably make games about, I don't know, Siege of Sarajevo, Siege of Vukovar, World War II in Yugoslavia, global thermonuclear war. That's another one. I'm just reading the book by Herman Kahn on thermonuclear warfare, which was always a topic that interested me. And I would really like to make a good, deep historical game, hypothetical game, not where you just move the rockets and kill everybody, but where you have some meaning of all that. Why would people think about warfare? I mean, there had to be some logic, that dark logic. So I have many interests. Some of them are about this, and I will definitely design games, video games, tabletop games, and the mix of one and the other.
So I want to congratulate you. I know the game has a lot of fans, and also, as you stated, not only in the United States but in Spain. I know people. I have a lot of contact with Spanish wargamers, and that's one of them.
It's been translated to Spanish in total.
One of them was very insistent. Joe, you have the game there. Give it a chance. It's a really good game. So I've dedicated some videos to it because I think it's something that we don't see very often, and it's a nice production. It plays fast, and it's an interesting topic. And I wish that you continue and design more of these games, and we'll be here to show them to the people and for further interviews. So I want to thank you, and thank you for letting me interview you.
Thank you for having me giving me this opportunity. Thank Compass Games for allowing me to do what I always wanted to do, and thank for all the people who play the game and enjoy the game.
Okay,
that's the best thing I can hope for.
Okay, so we are closing this session today. We want to thank our guest, Tomislav Čipčić, and this is Stuka Joe signing off for now. Thanks for watching.